So to begin our material today, we're going to first talk about first-time users. So this may be where you may already have your initial program set up and you've been doing the bank reconcilement. But I'm just going to briefly mention a few things about getting started for our first-time users. The initial setup of your balances, as we covered during the training of the general ledger setup, is under the GL menu and then transactions, starting balances. And so what we have is the initial GL starting date here. In these training files, I have January 1st of 2016, but you may have January 1st of 2017. And then for each account, like here we have our Bank of America payroll account, we have our starting balance. So normally when you're first moving over, you'll put in your complete balance sheet accounts here to bring over your GL balances. Now, if you've been using our software but you haven't been using the bank reconcilement or the accounting system, which we've had a few customers recently that were just doing payroll and they weren't using the full accounting system, decided they want to get started, you can reset your GL starting date. And the way you do that is in the Tools menu under Program Setup, and then it's on the General Ledger tab. There's a GL starting date here. So if you haven't been using the accounting and you want to get started, you can change this date to January 1st, 2017, and then you can use the starting balances to re-enter those starting balances where you want to begin. So if you have put in preliminary balances and these numbers have changed, for example, a lot of people when they started up the first week of January may have put in balances, but after doing their first reconciliation those have changed, you can always come back here and edit these before you start your first reconciliation. Now, that balance, if you have not balanced before, or if you haven't done a reconciliation before, you may need to do some adjustments to your starting balance to get it to a good starting point. So in our document, I have a little tip there if you haven't done your reconciliation, how you're going to calculate that starting balance. So you want to take your bank statement. Again, for using examples starting up in January, take your December statement. And then any checks that cleared in 2017, you are going to subtract from that ending balance from December 31st to get to your reconcilement. And so again, there may be some checks that still clear in February or March that you'll have to adjust that starting balance to get to the correct balance. Hopefully that's not the case with too many of you, but it has come up recently where some smaller companies hadn't been doing any bank reconciliations, didn't know what their starting point should be. So that's a way that you can backtrack. Additionally, if you're just getting started, we're putting in that reconciled balance as a starting balance. So there's a couple different ways that you can account for checks in your prior system that haven't cleared. So on the first page, there's 3 different options. I recommend the first option, and that is any outstanding checks from your prior software, you would go ahead and put into our checkbook. And so you would just go into your checkbook on your payables menu, and you'll use the expense check button. And if they're payroll or any companies where you don't have a vendor, you can use the no vendor account. And then just put in your check number, the date that it was actually issued. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and put in a 2015 check since my GL starts 2016. And then my date. I don't really have to worry about the accounting because, again, this is just to record an outstanding check. Our accounting is going to start as of our GL date. So now this check is added to our checkbook. So when we do our reconciliation, we can clear this off and we can keep track of that. If you notice, here's my GL starting date on 1/1/2016. That restarts my bank account balance. So again, those aren't affecting my general ledger, but they're in the system so I can do a complete reconciliation for my first month. If you have a lot of checks and that just seems like too much work for you, then there's two other options. One is to do your first month's reconciliation and make sure, go ahead and use your prior software or do it manually and determine just what checks are still outstanding after that first initial month, and just enter those checks. So if you have a heavy December payroll, you may have a lot of checks that are outstanding December 31st, but they clear by the end of January. So that can lessen how many transactions you put in. The only downfall is you don't have every single transaction in to be able to get a reconciliation report to show everything that was cleared. So sometimes it can be harder to finish or reconcile that first month. The third method is actually doing a manual where you don't put in any outstanding checks into our system and you just keep a report of what's still outstanding from your prior software. And when you do your first reconciliation, there would be a difference that would match those that are still outstanding. So again, just to be completely transparent and be able to see everything that's going on and be able to do a complete reconciliation, I recommend the first method, but that's up to you. Now, if you have adjusted your starting balances, then you do want to just have the program recalculate the running bank balance in the checkbook before you do your reconciliation. So if I changed this to $14,000, the program doesn't always get this recalculated. So there's two ways of recalculating the bank balance. The first is just clicking on this heading, balance. That'll bring up a little update bank balance box. You put in the first date of your GL starting date, and then that will go through and do a recalculation. That same option is also accessed from the right-click menu under Bank Account, and then Update Bank Balance, and it'll bring up the same box there. And you can go into your checkbook. If you want to jump to a particular date, you just hit 0 and then go down to the date, put in your GL starting date to review that those have been updated accordingly, correctly. Any questions so far on the starting balances or updating that bank account? The other thing that I'll mention is, depending on how many outstanding checks you have, we may be able to import a list if you have it in Excel instead of having to do the manual entry. So now to begin our bank reconciliation, we'll just come into the bank reconcilement option on the payables menu. You'll select your bank account, select your statement date, and we're going to talk about the statement date. The statement date is really important because that is what the program is going to use as a clear date. And then you're going to type in your statement balance. Now, if you are a new user, what you'll have is all of your transactions displayed here. I have some cleared, but what I want to point out initially is for the new users, in addition to marking off all the other checks that have cleared, you want to also mark off this starting amount and mark that as cleared. So now, what I recommend, starting with your reconciliation, most bank statements group transactions together. So under the display option here, you can go to deposits to see just your deposits. Now, the other setting that I recommend changing is on the right-click menu under display, changing the setting transactions from prior statements. Now, if it's your very first month reconciling, it's not going to matter because you haven't cleared anything before. But once you do your first month, it's easier to not see transactions that have already cleared. So you see just what you're dealing with. So now we can go to the cleared column. Now you can check with your mouse, or the other thing you can do is you can use your space bar and your up and down arrows. Now when you hit a transaction cleared with the space bar, it will automatically move down to the next transaction. So it makes it really fast to go through if you're reviewing each transaction as you clear it. The other thing while we have deposits up that I'll mention here is if you have multiple deposits on the same date, when you put your tooltip over one of those amounts, or your mouse, when you put your mouse over one of the amounts, it'll give you a tooltip, and it'll give you your total deposits on that day. Sometimes if you made multiple cash receipts entries, but the bank just put them in as one total, that is helpful to double check that you do have the right total of deposits for that day. So then once I've done my deposits, I can go to my display and go to my checks and go through and do the same clearing process on my checks. Now, one of the other shortcuts is if your bank prints the statement in check number order and there's asterisks between the gaps of checks, then you can use this little shortcut button down here, clear by check number. When you put in the range of numbers that have cleared, then the program will check mark those for you and do the whole range. So again, sometimes with large payrolls, you may have 100 checks that have all cleared. You can use that clear by check number to get those cleared. Now, you have to hit the button again, but if you like shortcuts, the shortcut key for the clear by check number is Control-K. And so you can see it on the right-click menu. You can get to the option there as well, but it shows you the shortcut key over to the right. Now, if you are just doing your first reconciliation, let's say you have been using Datatech software for multiple years, but you hadn't been using the reconciliation, the other thing you may want to do is clear by date. And I had this come up with, it was actually like 4 or 5 years that we used the clear by date on to get somebody caught up, and they're just updating their GL starting date, even though they've used the program for several years. They're just starting to use the AP system. So this can take a while. If that situation applies to you, then what you may want to do is before you leave for lunch, put in your dates and hit OK and let it run, because it'll take a while if you're doing a long date range there. Now, the other shortcut in being able to clear transactions quickly is on page 4 of the attached document. There is a details on what the program looks for if you want to be able to import cleared transactions. And this was originally done, I think, for a large company. Again, it had a very large amount of payroll checks. They downloaded the transactions from the bank's website. And so then we developed this import to save them a little bit of time. It will read in all the checks, mark them off for you, and then if there's any discrepancies, it will give you a report. So right now, this must be a CSV file. If you can only get an Excel file from your bank, let us know, and we could see possibly about importing this. Now, in the column headings, the program looks for either date or date up or lower. For a check number, it looks for customer reference, check number, serial number, check number alphabetized. Either any of those options, it will find the check number. And then amount in upper and lower or all uppers. And then cleared date. Now, I don't really like having the clear date on there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talked about how the clear date affects the clear transactions report and the bank reconciliation report. If you include cleared date in the file, it will use that as the cleared date, not the statement date. So now what we'll do is I'll show you how that import works. You go on the right-click menu again in your bank reconcilement window, and there's an Import Cleared Transactions, or the shortcut key for this is Control-I. And then you just go navigate to your file that you downloaded, and then it will give you the totals that have cleared. So it's going to mark off those two checks that did match to the amount. And then it gave me a report because this check number 5115, the amount in the file was 105, but the amount in my program was just 100. So it gives you that discrepancy. So you're probably familiar with that. Many times I see banks transpose numbers, and I don't know why, because it seems like it should all be electronic now, but sometimes they still clear things for the incorrect amount. So that gives you a way to go and investigate, and it's really apparent to you. It's not a hard process to find those discrepancies. So you can make a note of that if you go online to your bank's website and see what you're able to download. If the headings differ from what we have here, again, you can put in a support request to add the names that are in your download. And again, if it's not a CSV, that might be something that we can add. So that's the import option. The other way of clearing checks is there's a clear all, and same thing down at the bottom, there's a clear all. That would be with some of the smaller bank accounts, maybe where you don't ever have anything outstanding because it's just a few checks. That can be a tool you can use just to go through and clear all without having to do them one by one. So I'm going to just go ahead and clear a few more checks here. And then when you're done with those, if you have your tax payments or anything done electronically, you can then go to the miscellaneous and do any electronic withdrawals. As well, you might have those under transfers, if you have transfers between the accounts. Now, the OS checks, that's actually a particular type of outstanding check when we import outstanding from other programs. So that option doesn't show you anything unless it's been something that we've imported. So That's why people thought that would show just things that hadn't cleared, but that's not what that is. So again, on the other options on the right-click menu, if you are not finding a check number, maybe the dates are off or it's an old check number that you need to find to clear it, you can go on the right-click menu to find and select by amount or check number. And then you just type in the number and it will jump to that check. Or if you're off by a particular amount, and sometimes with ones in accounting departments, they remember amounts. And there's an amount that you're just not balancing to, it might be a check, then that find gives you an option to search for an amount. Now there's one trick here. Depending on where your cursor is at, you may need to search up or down. So I was at the bottom of the screen. If I hit down, it's not going to find anything. So I need to search up. And then it's found my next check for that amount. And then if that's not the amount, you just go to find. You can repeat last find, or you can search by amount again. And then it'll go to the next check it finds that amount on. Now, the same options for the display that's up at the top, that is also accessible on the right-click menu. So you can change the type of transactions that are displayed there. And then, as I mentioned, once you have done your first reconciliation, you would normally want to uncheck the transactions from prior statements so that you don't see all your old history on there. You've already reconciled those. You would only really need to go back to view those if there's an issue where you're having to go back to the previous month's reconciliation or see what was cleared in the last month. The other option, transactions after statement date, that is to filter out any transactions dated after your statement date. So we only see checks up to that date. Now, a reason why you may need to select this is if you handed out checks early and somebody actually got a check that cleared before the check date. So let's say you dated checks for February 1st, but you handed them out on Tuesday. Somebody actually goes to your bank and cashes it, and it gets into your January bank statement. So you may need to check that in order to view it and mark it as cleared. Now, the cleared date. When you put your mouse over any of the check boxes, you'll see the date that that transaction was cleared. So if your statement date is entered in incorrectly, that can cause problems because when you check mark the transaction, that's what will be set as the clear date. And so recently we had a few support calls. The customers just kind of weren't thinking, got used to 17, and they typed in December 31st, 2017, and had checkmarked transactions before they realized it. Well, then now the program thinks that didn't clear to 12/31/2017, so when they did their reconciliation for January, it wasn't cleared. And so that's exactly what our support department will say. Well, put your tooltip over there. What's the date on there? When does it say that it was cleared? And that was the issue. The other thing about the cleared transaction date is that's what the program uses for the cleared transaction report. And we're going to look at that next. But when you are doing your reconciliation, if you have any problems, one of the first things we're going to suggest is looking at the cleared transaction report. And this is on the right-click menu again, and we can go ahead and just preview it. And what this does is this gives us a report of what we cleared. So these are our deposits. We have a total of $54,650 on deposits. So we want to make sure the total deposits on the bank statement that those two numbers match. Then we have our total checks that we've cleared. And then we have our miscellaneous and our charges. If one of these numbers doesn't match, then of course we're not going to reconcile. So then, if this number doesn't match, we go through each item to figure out what doesn't match the bank statement. And so that's where the statement date, if we accidentally cleared something with a different statement date, it's not going to be reflected on that cleared transactions report. You may have cleared it and it's going to be clear on the reconciliation report, but it's just a little harder to go back and audit because you'd have to run the cleared transaction report for each date that you cleared checks on. And I just mentioned that that's come up recently because some customers do like a weekly online reconciliation, and then at the end of the month they're doing their final to the bank statement. Well, if you've used different statement dates clearing each week, those would all be on individual clear transactions reports because that's date sensitive based on what that statement date was. So in that case, what I recommended to them, even though they're doing a weekly reconciliation, they always use the ending date of the month. So when they get to the end of the month and they're doing their final reconciliation, they can get a cleared transaction report that combines everything. Now, the other thing with that, if you're not matching on your reconciliation, besides just checking all of these checks, you're looking for two things. You're looking for, actually probably three things. Something that you might have accidentally cleared that's on this report that's not on your bank statement. The second thing is you're looking for something on the bank statement that is not on this report. So maybe somebody took and hand wrote a check and it cleared the bank, but we just missed it in going through and checking things off because it wasn't in the list. It wasn't in our reconciliation screen. So in that case, we actually have to go back to the checkbook and add a check because it wasn't put in the system at all. The other thing, like I mentioned before, is when the banks clear something for an incorrect amount, sometimes it's necessary to actually go check by check and check amounts against the bank statement. So I know that's a hassle, but sometimes what it ends up boiling down to. The other thing that comes up is when checks were put into the wrong bank account. So back in your checkbook, you can now, if something was done to an incorrect bank account, you can go up and change the bank number and save it, and the program will move it to the correct bank account. So that can be something that you need to look for as well if you have multiple accounts. Now, when you're all said and done, if you have done everything correctly, I don't know that I have here because I was playing with my numbers. Oh, I just have one that I missed. We have our reconciliation report. So we have the balance from our bank statements, and then the checks that are still outstanding. So just takes anything that we haven't checkmarked. And then we have our total outstanding. And then it subtracts that from our bank balance because it's things we have issued, but it just hasn't cleared yet, so we really don't have that money. So that's our bank statement balance, and that should match the book. So here I'm off. I have this $625. I missed a check there, so I'm going to go back and find my check, re-clear it, and now we have our balanced reconciliation report and our summary of our transactions. Now, I know a lot of people don't like to keep the paper. I really suggest keeping paper just because if you need to go back if something happens, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, about preventing transactions from being edited. What we have now, this was part of our year-end update. If you've been using Datatech software for a while and didn't look at our year-end update, our new features, from the preview window, there's now a save button, and you can save things automatically as a PDF from the preview without having to do the Control-A. So then you can go ahead and just save this as a PDF if you don't want to keep the paper. And you may, create folders on your network or your computer for those. And again, it just kind of goes back to how much you want to keep. I like having the detail, so I normally do the bank reconciliation report and then also the cleared transactions report, and either keeping those as PDFs or a copy with the bank statement. Now, we have a few customers where they do their payroll, but they have bookkeeping services that manage the accounting. And so they do mark off the payroll checks from the bank statement that has cleared to monitor the payroll, but they don't really do the final reconciliation. It's done by a third party. So there is an option that we've added in the last year to export either cleared or outstanding transactions to Excel. So what they do is they go in and mark everything off, and then they do the cleared transaction to show the accountant or give the accountant the total of what has cleared. So once you do that export option, then it will export everything that you've cleared with that date and the type of transaction, the date, and the original check date and check number. Now, the other thing that comes up when you are not balancing, and a few of these little tips that I just went through on the cleared transactions is on the bottom of page 5 and then to page 6. The other thing that can come up is if there's any journal entries done, or like I mentioned, the starting balances that you may need to recalculate your bank balance. So that can be one of the easiest things you can try, is coming back to your checkbook and updating that bank balance and then seeing if that changes. The other thing that we have seen happen is where corrections or adjustments have been made to previous months, where you have completed a reconciliation, everything was okay, but now in the current month you can't find the issue, everything looks right in the current month, and maybe a user accidentally or intentionally deleted a check or edited a check, moved it to a different bank account, or changed an amount. So that is a case where the last thing usually that we ask you to do if you're not reconciling is go back to the previous month. And that's where keeping those reports are handy. Because we are tracking the statement date, you can go back to a prior month and rerun the reconciliation report. Of course, this isn't going to balance, but You can rerun the reconciliation report. It's going to have what didn't clear, and you can make sure this matches the previous month's printed or saved report. If now these totals aren't matching, then sometimes we have to go investigate further to figure out why the bank balance got off. We have some audit logs to try and do some of that through a backdoor program. But in the first place, some of the things that you can do to prevent those things from happening is implement the plan of using the closing modules date option. And this is on the general ledger menu under utilities and then close accounting modules. After you've done your bank reconciliation and everything is complete, we can put in our date here to close out the accounts payable module. Now, when you go in and try and do a transaction prior to that date, you'll get a notice that the accounts payable has been closed. And that will come up as well if you try and edit or delete a transaction prior to that date. Now, in addition to just putting that date in, you may need to go a step further with putting some additional security permissions on users. So this close accounting module, we would want that so users couldn't just come in and change it. The other thing that can be done is you can give somebody rights to open, save, and edit transactions but not delete. Or they might be able to open, save, and create new transactions but not edit or delete. So we're not going to spend the time to run through all the how to do permissions there. But if you want, you can go to our help and look for security. And there's a section on those security permissions. Actually, let me see. There is more information, I think, under operator setup. Yeah, operator setup has the more expanded permissions information. And then you can call our support department for help with that as well. But that's a lot of our support calls regarding bank reconciliation problems have come down to those two things, just your clear transactions not matching your bank statement and ones where the transactions from a prior period have been deleted or edited. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you haven't previously done reconciliations either manually or using a computer system and you don't really have a starting point, then you may need to adjust your starting point. And if you're sure that everything on the bank statement is cleared, your clear transaction report matches your bank statement, then the starting balance may be the issue. Now, the final thing that we're going to mention today is what to do about old outstanding payroll checks or any uncleared checks for that matter. A lot of our customers just keep checks on the outstanding list, and they have pages and pages of old outstanding payroll checks. So you may need to verify with your accountant, or if you have an attorney, to review the laws in your state if you're not in California, or what the laws are in California. I'm not an expert, but I know that I think it's 3 years, but I'm not 100% sure on that. You're supposed to keep track of unclaimed checks, and then at a certain point, those are supposed to be turned over to the state's unclaimed property division. So what we typically recommend is that you set up a liability account I don't know if I have one in here. Go ahead and create one. And then we do a journal entry. So that's, again, I'm not going to do details on the journal entries today, but you would go ahead and make a journal entry, and you would take that unclaimed payroll checks account, and you could even record what the original check number was. And you put in, for reference, the employee's number. It doesn't have a whole lot of room to do a name. And then for the liability side, it would be a negative because our liabilities are credit accounts. And then we're doing a debit to the bank account. And that's going to add that money back into our account to get that cleared off. So you would go through and do those two transactions for each check. I have some other stuff in here, but once you would do that, you would update that. Then on your next reconciliation, for each check, you'll clear both the outstanding check and that journal entry, the debit that's offsetting it. And that will clear it from your bank reconciliation. And then you have a more accurate reconciled bank statement balance because you know those checks, are probably, they're so old they're not going to clear. Now, if an employee comes back, then when you issue him a check, you would just do it through the checkbook using that unclaimed payroll check GL number. Some of our customers that are really on top of that, they actually do that within 4 or 5 months. If you have a deal where it's void, they can't cash it after 90 days, then that would clear those out since you're going to have to reissue them anyways. And that would be your more automated process of, instead of using like our void and reissue in the payroll where you're dealing with closed quarters, this is all handled through the GL and the checkbook. Now, one other little thing, if you want to add this cleared column to your checkbook, so when you're just looking in here, you can see if an item has cleared or not. That is on your right-click menu, and then under View, you can enable the Show Cleared column. That will show a check mark if the check has been cleared, and then it will also give you that date that it cleared in the little tooltip when you put your cursor over the cleared box. So that's the end of our material on your bank reconciliation. We hope that this has been helpful if you're just starting out your first reconciliation, or if you've been using it for a while, if you've got a few little tips or information on the import that you might be able to utilize. If you have any questions or need assistance, as I've been mentioning throughout, different questions and things that have come into our support department, go ahead and just, when you give us a call, go to option 1 for the support department, or you can email at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, at datatechag.com. Or if you're a new user and you want to schedule an appointment with me, then go ahead and shoot me an email, and we'll get that scheduled to get you going on that.